As we know, the resistance report is based on hospitals right now, and I think it has been since the beginning of this war. I remember reporting back in November, in the first days of the ground war, following day by day, when we don't know where the Israelis were going in Gaza, but it looked immediately like they were pushing towards the hospitals as their primary objective. At the beginning of the ground operation, it took the Israelis 3 divisions, more than 30,000 troops, to get into Gaza City. And they went straight for Shifa Hospital in the north. They went for the hospitals in the north as well. And right now, as we are 180 days into the war, the only Israeli operations at this moment are focused on the hospitals. They just wrapped up the operation at Shifa Hospital, and they are still besieging Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis and Al-Ahmal Hospital in Khan Yunis as well, in the same neighborhood of Khan Yunis. And as we heard from Abu Bakr, they are also bombing the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Darbala. So the focus of Israel's military push is on hospitals strictly, as we're seeing throughout this war. But now we have confirmation, because it's the only thing they're fighting for is the hospitals. Their chief of staff, Halevi, was in Shifa Hospital bragging about the operation at Shifa. And today, that was the other day, and today he's just photographed with his generals, with his commanders, at Nasser Hospital, where the operation is going on today. So this is Israel attempting to have images of victory for their own people, where they sack these hospitals that had previously already been sacked. So, in terms of a military strategy for the Israelis, the fact that they have to enter Shifa Hospital, where they told us the first time there was a massive command and control bunker under the hospital, which never materialized. But they have to raid the same hospital weeks later. In Khan Yunis, it was even quicker. Al-Amal Hospital was shut down by the Israelis. The Palestinians got it up, and within 10 days of the hospital being up, it's reinvaded again by the Israelis. So the target of these military operations, and it almost seems bizarre to be doing military breakdowns that are strictly based on hospitals, but here we are 180 days into this. So maybe we can show some of these pictures from Shifa Hospital. Nora did a great job in the introduction talking about Shifa Hospital. But on Sunday, the Israelis, which they have done previously, toured journalists through the hospital before the operation was over. And so these pictures here are from a Washington Post journalist who toured on Sunday. The Israelis left overnight on Sunday, Shifa Hospital. And you can see the buildings are all destroyed at Shifa Hospital. And you can see burn marks. There clearly have been burned, and that can happen from tank shelling. But when we go to these next pictures, and you can see the inside of the hospital here is completely destroyed. Palestinians are known for their ingenuity, but this hospital apparently looks like it's going to have to be completely rebuilt. So they've destroyed the most important medical center in the Gaza Strip, the largest hospital. They drove the 10,000 internally displaced peoples who were in the hospital out, and the people who remained in the hospital were too maimed and injured to get themselves out. And if you look at an image like this, what we're showing you now for the listening audience, we're looking at a completely charred building of the Shifa Hospital, completely burn-faced on the facade, completely burned. The Israelis have clearly, because you could see in the Washington Post images before that the burning wasn't this total on Sunday. And so they've gone, as they're leaving the hospital, the Israelis are torching the buildings. There's no military purpose. I don't need to be the one to tell you this, that there's no military purpose to burning the place down as you leave, to burning what amounts to a crime scene, and burning people alive and dead inside the hospital. When the Washington Post visited on Sunday, they said they couldn't see a single Palestinian. Now we're looking at images from the early morning of Monday as the Israelis left, and hundreds of Palestinians are showing up into the courtyard that was previously the courtyard of the hospital. After the first Shifa raid in November, the courtyard became a mass grave, if we'll remember that. And so we know that that's a mass grave already from the first operation, and they're going to have to make another one for the second. The Israelis bulldozed people, ran over people alive. And the testimonials that will come out in the coming days from this brutal crime at Shifa Hospital, I think, will be well known to everybody. It's clear the Israelis have no intelligence on the ground in Gaza. They're raiding these hospitals because they're the only place that they can access. If Israel wanted a military image of victory and they had intelligence on the ground, they could raid military facilities and take pictures of them overrunning military facilities. But there's nothing like that. We don't see anything of the sort in Israel's field reports. We don't even see tunnel operations happening in Israeli reports anymore. But what we see is footage like this. This is just appalling footage from Shifa Hospital. And it shows that there's no strategy by the Israelis. The strategy is destruction. And this raid, the first raid into Shifa Hospital, it took them 3 weeks with 3 divisions to get into Gaza. And this time they're bragging because of the destruction of Gaza City and because, as I've reported previously, because of the Netzarim corridor that the Israelis are building to cut the Gaza Strip in half south of Gaza City. There's now effectively a military highway, as they're calling it, that runs from the Israeli border to the sea. And so they're able to raid the hospital in Shifa. This is the neighborhood that we're looking at now. They completely destroyed the neighborhood around the hospital because that's where the resistance was. The resistance put up a fight at Shifa Hospital. Last week, I showed you a dozen videos showing more than a dozen armored vehicles being blown up in the area of the hospital because the fight was in the neighborhood of the hospital, defending the hospital, not inside the hospital. And the Israelis themselves say that. The Washington Post tried to press the Special Forces commander, the colonel who we saw last week, speaking with his face hidden, the 𝐓𝐡𝐞 13, the Flotilla 13, the Israeli elite Navy SEALs who raided this hospital. He said that there was only dozens of fighters inside the hospital, and they're not even fighters. They're people who defended themselves in emptied buildings. Fighting in emptied buildings. They're not fighting over top of the maternity ward or fighting in the emergency ward. These are on the hospital campus being pressed by Israeli troops. And Ali talked about the doctors that were killed in front of their families. The World Health Organization talks about 21 patients that died. But the kind of accounting is very difficult to have at this point because the Israelis held the hospital for 2 weeks. And at the end of the first week, they'd said they'd killed 180 people. And at the end of the second week, they said the same number. So they're holding the hospital and fighting outside in the neighborhood. And that's what they did. We're looking here for the listening audience at a completely destroyed landscape as far as you can see around the hospital. And they did the same thing as they did in the hospital, around the hospital. They burnt the buildings. They showed on their TikTok videos their soldiers lighting up the buildings and burning them as they're leaving the neighborhood. These are not military tactics. These are there's no real other way to say it. They're serial killer tactics. They're burning evidence. They're destroying for the sake of destroying. And this is what's been happening for the past 2 weeks at Shifa. And it's been happening at Nasser Hospital as well. But the resistance has been fierce all around Shifa Hospital. This is going to turn out to be one of the biggest battles of the war. The Israelis are calling it that already. The number of attacks was more than 75 field reports. And we know that the previous time the Israelis re-invaded Gaza City was when they went into Zaytun neighborhood, and that was the Battle of Zaytun, which was one of the biggest battles as well. And so what we're seeing from the Israelis is just these raids and sacking of hospitals, dismantling of the healthcare system. And what we're seeing from the Palestinian resistance is the capability and ability to resist and to operate in cohesive units still now 6 months on into this war. So there's no ability for Israel to say that they have victory over their fighters. We don't see any footage at all of the Israelis overrunning military positions and finding recent weaponry. All the weapons that we see the Israelis capturing for their photo ops are old AK-47s that are all over the Gaza Strip. They're not only in the hands of fighters, and we don't see any of the kind of weapons that we're going to talk about on the show today, or that we've talked about in these reports for the last 6 months. Palestinian weaponry built by their own hands. We would be seeing, if they were overrunning military positions, we would be seeing Yasin RPGs in lines. We haven't seen that at all. We would see weapons factories being uncovered where these weapons are built, the weapons that have built enough Yasins to fight for 6 months, enough rockets to fight for 6 months and not show any signs of depletion of these resources. We don't see any indication of these facilities being overrun at all. And so there's really no signs of victory for the Israelis. They talk about dismantling battalions, but that doesn't mean anything. They're talking about combat ineffective, which is a military term that denotes 1/3 of the fighting force is unable to fight. And that's what they're talking about, dismantling battalions, because they've said that they dismantled the battalions in the north, but they clearly didn't, because these battalions are who are fighting the last 2 weeks in one of the biggest battles of the war. So they're able to still mount the largest battles of the war 6 months on. So the brutal site at Shifa, it's weird to even put it into a military report, because it doesn't have anything like a military impact. And the 𝐄𝐥𝐿 13, the Navy SEAL commander, the colonel, told the Washington Post, as they stood around the completely destroyed Shifa hospital, he said, "Look what they made us do." That kind of language. There's no signs of victory for the Israelis here. We're seeing signs of defeat. And nobody, I think, I don't want to speculate, but I think we can be pretty sure that nobody in months from now, in years from now, is going to talk about an Israeli military victory in Gaza. We're seeing a massacre of civilians, the dismantling of the public healthcare system, public education system, every university destroyed, schools destroyed, the Israelis using hospitals as bases and then burning them down as they leave, using universities as bases and then blowing them up as they leave, and putting them on TikTok, as we saw with Isra University most starkly. But all the universities are involved, and anytime we have guests from Gaza talking about that, they always talk about their universities, where they were in their degrees, and these schools don't exist anymore at all because of this operation. There's the military justification for carrying out a genocide on this level is enormous, and there's no signs anything like that from the Israelis. So let's take a look at some of the videos from the resistance. This is a 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 video. We could do number 1 here tomorrow. This is a 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 video around the hospital. This is a Namr troop carrier that we're seeing in between the buildings. We're seeing here multiple camera angles of this vehicle. Namr troop carrier with 12 soldiers. You could see the trophy active protection system on the top of that vehicle there. And you can also see at the back, and here's a 𝐓𝐡𝐞 𝐄𝐥𝐞𝐜 fighter with a Yasin 105. firing on that troop carrier that has, and there we're seeing the camera on the barrel of the Yasin. Just to point out, it's interesting to note, and I pointed it out on last week's show as well. We're seeing Saraya al-Quds fighters, Islamic Jihad fighters, fighting with Yasin 105s, the Qassam army built weapon. And this Saraya al-Quds Islamic Jihad fighter in this video is using a Yasin 105, and it's painted black, suggesting that Saraya al-Quds has a stock of these weapons too now that they're using here later in the war. This footage that we're seeing also indicates, just looking around at the footage we're seeing, you see total destruction, blown out buildings that have no military purpose, because we're seeing that these blown out buildings can become simple sniper positions, observation points, surveillance points. We're watching here the same video from 3 different angles because we have multiple cameramen. They're showing the triangle there of a soldier poking his head out of the hatch of the Namr troop carrier. And there you see a very good shot of the Yasin 105 with the tandem charged warhead, 2 warheads on it. We'll talk more about that later on, but you can see Saraya al-Quds using that weapon. And so we're seeing, again, 3 different angles of this shot. Now we're going down into the streets with a unit who's moving through the streets, because the Israelis don't come out of their tanks. They're not dismounted. The tanks are all parked in the parking lot, in the courtyard, in the graveyard that is Shifa Hospital. And the soldiers aren't trying to clear this neighborhood block by block in any kind of military procession, a logic. We're just seeing them sitting inside their vehicles, shelling the hospital and destroying the neighborhood from the air and from tank shelling. But spotters in multiple places, and in this footage, they fighters down on the street are carrying out machine gun operations, light machine gun operations down on the street. And again, just to see the footage of these destroyed buildings and the way that the neighborhood has been destroyed has no military purpose, because it's difficult for the armored vehicles to move through the neighborhood when the streets are destroyed like this. The tracks on their vehicles can't handle the broken concrete. And so we see there the Yasin fighter. And there's another video, number 2, Tamara, is also a Saraya al-Quds video from the neighborhood of Shifa Hospital. And here we're watching, again, Saraya al-Quds Islamic Jihad. Their videos, they let us go a little bit longer with their fighters. Their crops aren't so tight. And you can see them within 50 meters of an Israeli Merkava tank. And the fighter using a tandem 105, which is a Gaza-built weapon that made all of their previous warheads from the previous generation. They added a second charge to them to make them more effective against the increased Israeli armor. So we're seeing fighters moving through the neighborhood of Shifa because the Israelis are hiding in their tanks. Palestinians are able to get these kind of shots away at soldiers in their armored vehicles that are not dismounted. The Israelis have acknowledged 3 casualties in the Shifa Hospital raids, multiple from their armored brigade, which suggests that they were inside their armored vehicles when they were hit. We could go to number 4 here, Tamara, because we can see in this one, this is Qassam mortar teams operating, and we're still seeing mortar teams operating in conjunction with each other. We're about to see, this is the Qassam Brigade's video, we're about to see 5 separate mortar units operating in synchronicity, in unison, during the defense of Shifa Hospital. And these weapons are also built by the Palestinians. And this is a sign he's showing us here as he's loading the mortars into his mortar launcher. And the sign shows what the date is. They're showing the date that the video is published, showing us that they're still getting these videos out within, literally within minutes, within hours of these operations. They're not holding these for days and giving us a best of. And that's what we see on these fighters, showing on placards what the date is, what the location is, what unit is firing. And so we're seeing 5 different 𝐤𝐿 units here. And now 𝐤𝐿, in part of their military development, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, their weapons industry focused on getting mortars developed, developing their own mortars to carry out a strategy at the time. While there was Israeli settlements inside the Gaza Strip, the 𝐤𝐿 units, the 𝐤𝐿 military apparatus, the military development decided that the need was to create mortars for part of its anti-settlement strategy. The way that the 𝐤𝐿 brigades during the Second Intifada, all of the Palestinian resistance, but particularly the professionalization of the 𝐤𝐿 brigades, starts with the Second Intifada. And they developed their own mortar shells to fire on the Israeli settlements, which ultimately made the settlements impossible to defend for the Israelis through a number of tactics, not just mortars, all kinds of sophisticated military operations that carried out for the 5 years from the beginning of the Second Intifada in 2000 until the Israeli withdrawal in 2005. So we're seeing, we saw Saraya al-Quds, Islamic Jihad, using Gaza-based weapons to fight. We're seeing 𝐤𝐿 here, mortar teams using Gaza-made mortars. And this last fighter here, he's going to tell us to the camera after this unit fires here. The last fighter says that if Netanyahu thinks that by killing and starving our children, we will deviate from our path, that we will surrender, that he's already lost. And that's what we're seeing this fighter here talking to the camera saying as he launches mortar rounds from his position. So 𝐤𝐿 makes their own 60 millimeter, 81 millimeter, and 120 millimeter mortars that we're seeing used effectively here during the battle.
Thanks for watching this video. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit like, leave a comment. These engagements help us with the YouTube algorithm, and it helps us to get around Silicon Valley censorship as much as possible. It does make a difference. You can also support our journalism by going to electronicintifada.net and clicking on donate now. Thank you.